Something terrible was about to happen in the spring of 1982. In a quiet park in Anchorage, Alaska, 4 young friends were setting up camp for what should have been a perfect evening. They had snacks, music, and plans to catch a movie later. The air was warm enough that they had traded their heavy winter coats for light hoodies. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But someone was already watching them. Someone who had made a decision that would change everything forever. Someone who had already killed before and walked free. Someone the system had failed to stop. What happened next would shock the entire city and force Alaska to change its laws forever. This is a story about 2 different men in 2 different places whose crimes were so brutal that still make people shiver today. But before we get to that night in Alaska, we need to understand how these men slipped through the cracks of justice, how they were free to hunt when they should have been locked away, and how the warning signs were there all along, but nobody was paying attention. The first man nobody really noticed. Maybe that's exactly why he got away with it for so long. His name was Charles, and he grew up in a house where silence was heavy and frightening. His mother suffered from a mental illness that cast shadows over their family home in Michigan. Stories about his childhood were few, but those who remembered him described a boy who never quite connected with the world around him. At 16, he left home and never returned. He drifted across the country, picking up small arrests along the way. Shoplifting here, trespassing there. His criminal record was short but strange. By the early 1970s, he had made his way to Alaska, just another face in a state full of people running from something. Then, in 1973, something inside him broke completely. He met a young man named Robert, a 22-year-old grocery store worker. There was no fight between them, no argument, no reason at all. Charles would later tell police that he simply didn't like the way the young man talked, so he beat Robert to death in a park with a piece of metal he found on the ground. He didn't run. He didn't lie. He turned himself in and told the police everything. But instead of going to prison, Charles was declared not guilty by reason of mental illness. Doctors said he had paranoid mental problems and sent him to a high-security hospital in California for people who had committed crimes while mentally ill. For 7 years, he stayed in that hospital. Then in 1980, doctors made a decision that would cost 4 young people their lives. They said Charles was better. They said he was no longer hearing voices. They said he wasn't violent anymore. He seemed calm, medicated, and cooperative. So they let him go. Charles was transferred back to Alaska for supervised re-entry into society. That's how the system works when someone is considered no longer dangerous. They try to slowly reintroduce them with oversight. But the oversight didn't last long enough. Charles started working regular jobs. He washed dishes, worked in clothing stores, kept books for small businesses. He even enrolled in college classes. He was quiet. He showed up on time. He didn't cause trouble. And because of strict privacy laws, none of his bosses, co-workers, or classmates ever knew that the man working beside them had beaten someone to death just a few years earlier. But Charles started drinking again. That should have been a huge warning sign. One of the most important conditions of his release was that he stay sober. But nobody noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. And slowly, the thin barrier between Charles and his violent impulses began to dissolve. Then came May 3rd, 1982. Charles later told investigators that someone had stolen his favorite shirt. Nobody knows if this was even true or just something his troubled mind created. But he became obsessed with it. He wanted revenge. Or as he put it, I wanted to steal something back. That day, he bought a blue bicycle and a gun from a local shop. He wrapped the weapon in cloth, rode the bike into the woods near Russian Jack Springs Park, and buried the gun under a patch of melting snow. He was preparing for something terrible. That evening, as darkness began to fall, Charles returned to the park. That's where he found them. 4 teenagers were camping near a trail. Joseph, 19, was the first to spot him. Charles had crept up near their tent, probably looking for something to steal. When Joseph caught him, Charles pulled out the gun and shot the young man in the back of the head. The second boy, Vern, 18, ran toward the sound of the gunshot. Charles shot him in the face. Then came the 2 girls. 17-year-old Rebecca and 16-year-old Sabrina came to see what was happening. One by one, he turned the gun on them. 4 shots. 4 young lives ended. Charles didn't take anything. He didn't speak to them. He just picked up his empty bullet casings, buried the gun again, and rode off into the darkness on his blue bicycle. 3 days later, hikers found the bodies. They were still in the clearing, partially sunk into the thawing ground. Police arrived to find almost no clues. No wallets were missing. No valuables were taken. There were no signs of a struggle. It seemed like a perfect crime. But then, investigators found something. A blue bicycle abandoned nearby. It was a rare model sold at only one shop in town. Police pulled the sales records and found just one recent purchase under that model: Charles Meech. When they brought him in for questioning, he confessed immediately. Calmly. Coldly. He told them where he had hidden the gun, where he bought the bike, how he approached the teenagers, how each one died. When asked why, he gave no real reason other than, "I had a few drinks and I did all the things I wasn't supposed to do." Charles tried once again to use the mental illness defense, but Alaska had changed its laws just weeks before the murders. Now the burden was on the defense to prove that someone couldn't tell right from wrong. Charles had hidden the weapon. He had buried the evidence. He confessed in perfect detail. The jury didn't believe he was mentally ill during the crime. He was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 396 years in prison. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever given in Alaska. The public was outraged when they learned the truth. Charles had been quietly released back into society after killing someone in 1973. Employers were furious. Parents were terrified. Everyone wanted to know how a man who had already murdered someone could be walking around town with no supervision, able to buy a weapon and choose his next victims. Charles died in prison in December 2004. Natural causes. There was no obituary, no family statement, no memorial service. But the story doesn't end there. Hundreds of miles away, in the wooded landscape of East Texas, another man was about to prove that the system's failures weren't limited to Alaska. His name was Jerry, and he was born in 1948 in rural Texas. Unlike Charles, Jerry's childhood didn't include the typical background that people expect from violent criminals. No reported abuse, no severe trauma. But teachers and neighbors remembered him as quiet, tense, and strangely cold. He didn't act out in obvious ways. He didn't pick fights with other children. But when he looked at you, people said it felt like he was trying to figure out how much pain you could handle. By his late teens, Jerry had dropped out of high school and was drifting across Texas doing manual labor, mechanic work, welding, construction, always short-term jobs. People who worked with him would later say the same thing over and over. He gave off a weird energy. Not angry, not threatening, just wrong. In 1972, he was convicted of a brutal attack on a woman. He served 5 years in prison and was released. A year later, he was arrested again for another violent assault. In 1978, it happened again. This time, he was finally given a longer sentence. But despite the clear pattern of violence and the obvious risk he posed, the Texas Parole Board made a decision in 1985 that would cost 3 young people their lives. They released Jerry early. No ankle monitor, no restrictions, just out. He moved to Hawkins, a small wooded town in East Texas where nobody knew his name, nobody knew his record. He worked odd jobs and drove a distinctive 2-tone blue and white truck. On May 4th, 1986, 3 young people drove out to Lake Hawkins for a quiet afternoon by the water. Suzanne was 18 and had just been accepted to college. Gina was 20 and studying psychology. Brian was 19 and known around town for always helping anyone who had car trouble. They were the kind of people who made others smile just by being around. They parked near the trees, turned up the radio, and walked toward the lake. They weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't involved in any kind of trouble. They were just young and free, enjoying a beautiful spring day. What happened next was pieced together by detectives later through evidence and witness statements. At some point during the afternoon, Jerry approached them, likely with a weapon. He forced them into their car and drove them away from the lake. Witnesses later remembered seeing his distinctive truck parked near the area, watching. The next morning, Suzanne's body was found on Barnwell Mountain. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The way her body was positioned indicated that she had been posed after death, showing a level of cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. 2 days later, the bodies of Gina and Brian were discovered in a ditch off a rural road. Both had been shot in the head at close range. Police quickly began connecting the dots. Witnesses described a man matching Jerry's appearance near the lake. His truck had been seen in the area. When they brought him in for questioning, they found he still had the murder weapon, a revolver. Tests proved it was the same gun used to kill Gina and Brian. Fibers from Suzanne's clothing were found in his vehicle. It was enough evidence to charge him with capital murder. The town thought it was over. They thought they were finally safe. They were wrong. On July 9th, 1986, Jerry did something that sent the entire region into panic. He escaped from jail. He managed to overpower a guard, steal a weapon, and kidnap a 24-year-old female jail employee named Rosalie. He handcuffed her to himself and fled in a stolen car. They disappeared into the thick East Texas woods. For 16 terrifying hours, Rosalie was his prisoner. She would later say that Jerry acted completely calm the entire time, smiling, talking like everything was normal. At one point, he told her something that made her blood run cold. "I've already killed 3 people. 1 more won't matter." Rosalie finally managed to escape when Jerry fell asleep, and she was able to slip out of the handcuffs. The manhunt that followed was massive. Over 1,000 officers from multiple agencies, helicopters, search dogs, roadblocks everywhere. Local residents were told to lock their doors and stay inside. After 2 days of searching, Jerry was found hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Surprisingly, he surrendered without a fight. In 1987, Jerry went on trial for Suzanne's murder. The courtroom was packed with angry, grieving community members. Prosecutors presented evidence from all 3 killings, plus his past convictions and his dramatic escape from jail. The jury took less than an hour to sentence him to death. Jerry was sent to Texas's death row, where he spent 12 years in solitary confinement, filing appeal after appeal. He never gave interviews to reporters. He never expressed any remorse for what he had done. He didn't deny his crimes. He just didn't seem to care. On October 14th, 1999, Jerry was executed by lethal injection. But even that wasn't the end of the story. In 2019, 20 years after Jerry's execution, cold case detectives in Portland, Oregon, reopened an old case from 1979. A 20-year-old woman named Anna had been found in her apartment, brutally assaulted and strangled. There had never been any suspects. The case had gone completely cold. But DNA evidence from the crime scene had been preserved. Investigators ran it through new forensic technology that compares crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases. The match was clear and shocking. Jerry Walter McFadden. He had been there, in Oregon, in 1979, 7 years before the Lake Hawkins murders. 7 years before anyone in Texas even knew his name. Authorities now believe there may be many more victims. Women attacked in different states, different years. Jerry moved around constantly in the 1970s and 1980s. There were gaps in his record, times when he simply disappeared for months at a time. In an age before digital records and instant communication, someone like Jerry could vanish with a fake name, a stolen license plate, and a quiet back road. And he knew how to wait. He knew how to watch. He knew how to pick the exact moment when nobody was looking, then strike quickly and fade back into the shadows. Even law enforcement has admitted they may never know the full scope of Jerry's crimes across multiple states and decades. After his final arrest, one of the investigators who worked the case described Jerry in a single word that still haunts those who heard it. Empty. You looked in his eyes, the investigator said, and there was just nothing there. Today, Russian Jack Springs Park in Alaska is still open to the public. People walk those trails, camp in those clearings, and enjoy the natural beauty. There's no marker where the 4 teenagers died. Most people who visit have no idea what happened there. Lake Hawkins in East Texas is also still a popular spot for young people. Families still come to swim and fish. The lake is beautiful and peaceful, but some locals remember, and they watch their children a little more carefully. These cases changed laws in both Alaska and Texas. Alaska tightened its rules for releasing people who had been found not guilty by reason of mental illness. Texas reformed its parole system to prevent early release of violent criminals. But the changes came too late for 7 young people who simply wanted to enjoy life. 4 friends in Alaska just wanted to camp under the stars and catch a movie later. 3 friends in Texas just wanted to spend a sunny afternoon by the lake. They were students, workers, dreamers. They helped their neighbors, made their families proud, and had bright futures ahead of them. Joseph, Vern, Rebecca, and Sabrina in Alaska. Suzanne, Gina, and Brian in Texas. They deserve to grow up, fall in love, start careers, have families of their own. Instead, they became victims of a system that failed to protect them from men who should never have been free to hunt again. The most chilling part of both stories isn't the violence itself. It's how easily it could have been prevented. Charles had already killed someone. Jerry had already attacked multiple women. The warning signs were there. The danger was clear. But bureaucracy, legal technicalities, and a system more concerned with rehabilitation than public safety allowed 2 predators to walk free and choose their next victims. 7 families lost children they'll never get back. 7 futures were erased in moments of senseless violence. 7 lights were snuffed out by men whose eyes showed nothing but emptiness where human compassion should have been. And somewhere out there may be other cases that went cold, 'cause nobody connected the dots in time. That's the truly terrifying part of these stories. Not just what these men did, but what they might have done that we'll never know about. The investigators were right about Jerry. When you looked in his eyes, there really was nothing there. And Charles, described by those who knew him as someone who never quite connected with the world around him, proved that some people are simply too dangerous to ever be given a second chance. These cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it walks quietly among us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sometimes it looks ordinary, even harmless. Sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones nobody notices until it's too late. Do you want to learn more about criminal behavior and how to stay safe in our society? These tragic stories show us how important it is to recognize warning signs and understand how dangerous people think and act. Share this story and follow our channel so more people can stay aware and protect themselves and their families from harm.